Hi everyone, welcome back to Real Talk, our Campus Weekly video series where we discuss relationships, empathy, advocacy, and life. All of our episodes are pre-recorded and released every Tuesday at 5 p.m. on our IGTV and Facebook page through a YouTube link. So as you may have noticed, we have another guest speaker with us today, and we're so excited to have you, Johanna. So Johanna actually used to work at the Women's Center with us and did a lot of adult trainings and programs, kind of in the more adult population of our community, and also helped us with our K through 12 education and programs, and led just all the hats, led our certification training program, so for new volunteers and new staff. So, and now, or not now, it hasn't been that long, I guess, or it has been long, I don't know, we miss you.
It's been 3 years. Isn't that wild?
That is a while. So
I know, I miss you too.
Yeah, we all miss you at the Women's Center, but especially me the most. But yeah, so obviously then Johanna moved on to other things. She is now at Wesleyan University. And so the reason we asked Johanna to join us today is we're going to be talking about restorative justice. And we wanted to look at it through the lens of a university or a college and kind of what that looks like, what it means for survivors, what it means for offenders, and just kind of being curious about what it means. So that's my intro. I'll just pass it off to you, Johanna, to give any introduction of yourself.
Amazing. Thanks, Cara. And thanks, Holly, for having me.
Yeah.
So my formal title at Wesleyan is the director of the SHAPE office, which stands for Support, Healing, Activism, and Prevention Education. So I do my role can be broken up into kind of 2 buckets. So I do some advocacy work. So I hold space for folks who have experienced harm. So if any student identifies as having experiences of intimate violence, knows someone who has an experience, or has questions about an experience, I can be a confidential resource for holding that space and getting them connected to resources. And then the other part of my role is doing the prevention education programming so that we can start imagining a world where intimate violence doesn't happen and what that work looks like.
Yeah.
And I really came to know about RJ and restorative justice really from my students. And I had, it's funny because I had an introduction to it. I didn't know it was an introduction to it until I had my students give me permission to start connecting the dots. And I'm not just saying that. I really think that I've learned so much from my students and my experience at Wesleyan. I have a background in Holocaust and genocide studies, and I did some research into understanding how communities in post-genocide areas, like, basically unpack and heal from deep-seated trauma, particularly where there's sexual violence that's a part of that conflict and experience of harm. And restorative practices was a huge part of that. I just didn't make the connection of restorative justice being something that you could also do in sexual violence and responding to intimate violence in other contexts.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit about me, and I'm not an expert by any means. I'm still figuring out and trying to understand and asking a lot of questions. But that's some things that are on my heart that I'm thinking about.
Yeah, and I think we're coming from the same place of like curiosity and learning, and for probably a lot of our students watching this right now, maybe they've never even heard of that term before. I know it's even a relatively new term for some advocates, like, you know, us learning about it and learning more. So, you know, we'll definitely give some time to define that term. But before we do that, I was curious if you can give just like a picture of what the culture at Wesleyan kind of looks like, because obviously at WCSU, you know, it's a community, but it's in a community, like Danbury itself, you know, where the campus is located, and there's even technically 2 campuses in Danbury. So it's kind of, I know some colleges and universities, the college is the community. WCSU is not really as much like that because it's in kind of a town city where there's a lot kind of around it going on. And so that impacts kind of what the culture looks like on campus, the involvement of students in different, spaces on campus, if there's a lot of commuters and things like that. So just curious if you can give us like a picture of what Wesleyan kind of looks like.
Yeah, definitely. So Wesleyan is a small private liberal arts institution. So it, excuse me, is an all residential campus also. So all students are required to be living on campus, and they have different opportunities of living on campus through like dorm styles or house styles. That's awkward.
Yeah.
But, so like it's not like you're gonna live in a dorm all your 4 years, but you do technically live on campus throughout the whole time in your experience. There's about almost 3,000 undergraduate students and closer to like 300 graduate students on campus in terms of demographics. And our students are also very involved, and activism is like the core part of what it means to be a Wesleyan student and to be engaging in the work. I've never been at a place, this is only my second job outside of grad school, so like I'll own that. But like the working at this place, like I feel like I am constantly challenged to engage in critical reflection on my own positionality, from thinking about how my identity and how it shows up as a white woman, and also of how I should be mindful of how I'm doing that and engaging in my work and supporting the people that I support. And there's not a way that you can separate like the person that you are with the professional person or the professional student that you are. I think there's a culture of integrating all of that, and like trying to encourage people to like bring their whole selves into the space, at least from my perspective. I'm one person in a sea of many people. And we have a lot of international students, and people who also study abroad is like a very common experience. So people are weaving into their conversations or like workshops that I'm a part of or connected to, or lectures that you go to, many different experiences outside of Wesleyan too, which I think is another valuable part of what makes Wesleyan cool. So
that is really cool. So different, like so different than WCSU, and kind of the culture, even the vibe, like just sounds so unique of a campus. But it's interesting. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Holly.
No, I'm just saying, like, requiring students to live on campus, I think that cultivates such like a different sense of community, because you all live together, like your lived experiences are on campus. And WCSU, like some students do live on campus, but some are commuters, and just how that changes your experience of college.
Exactly. Yeah. And when you mentioned the like knowing and being cognizant of your identity and how that like is going to influence how you're able to support different students, that was honestly when we were talking about restorative justice as a topic for Real Talk. That was kind of where it started for me in learning about restorative justice, was hearing it from people of color and looking at it through the lens of the very broken systems that really kind of swallow up, particularly people of color, particular males of color, and having trouble because of those systems, and obviously the systemic racism that kind of influences those systems, that prevents them from being able to kind of re-enter society, re-enter a community, but then seeing it through the lens. So I was kind of learning about it initially through the lens of kind of racism and race in systems, but then seeing how that also intersects with our issues of interpersonal violence. It's just fascinating to me and hopefully to our audience. But I think it's going to be really interesting to dive into like, what it looks like and hear what work that you've been doing at Wesleyan about it. So maybe we can start just with like a definition. Restorative justice. I found one online, but maybe we can just go with how you would define it, since you are way more involved in this work and know how to speak of it.
Okay, pressure's on. So
unless you want me to give the little online definition to give context, I can totally do that.
Maybe you can add the online one, because I tend to speak from my heart, and sometimes my heart is very metaphor-y.
I love your heart.
Not everyone loves metaphors. So I think what restorative justice, what restorative practices mean to me is that it's really a lifestyle, it's a praxis, it's a way of imagining a world and a system for negotiating conflict that is honoring people's humanity and bringing space for people to bring their whole selves to that experience, whatever that looks like. And that can be when we're talking about if people have an argument over dinner and it devolves into like people saying they're not going to be friends anymore, to an experience of intimate violence. I think that there's the model of restorative practices and restorative justice, as I understand it, is trying to center people's humanity and also create the possibility and honor the possibility that everyone is capable of growth and change, and being offered a pathway back to community.
Yeah. Beautiful. I love your heart, and your heart explained that so beautifully. But yeah, I think, and a lot of the like themes of what you just described and how you would define it, I think relate to the one that I found online, which I'll pull up just to. So this definition described restorative justice sees crimes as an act against the victim and shifts the focus to repairing the harm that has been committed against the victim and community. It believes that the offender also needs assistance and seeks to identify what needs to change to prevent future reoffending. And that was, I think, really like my understanding of it too, and kind of starting to learn about it, is the concept of, you know, it's not to say that the harm wasn't harmful, right, of whatever violence took place, but that we have to find a way as a society, not necessarily maybe as advocates, it's maybe not our place, right? We center survivors, we don't with offenders, so people. And I've even had conversations with some other advocates about some victims can also offend violence and perpetrate violence. And so they almost hold like, or can behave in abusive ways, but also have their own experiences when they were a victim of violence. So you can't kind of just put a label on someone as always, you know, you're a perpetrator, you're a victim. Sometimes people are both. And it's so complex. So honoring like what you were saying, that there's a pathway back to kind of, you know, whatever that looks like for them re-entering the world, re-entering society, re-entering a community, and giving them a chance to do that. While still honoring the survivor's experience and not negating it.
Yeah.
Is that right? Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean that feels good to me, and I also feel it's important to say that this is not new. Like restorative justice and restorative practices have gotten this like trendy new revamp kind of thing, I think. And restorative practices are something that were created by Indigenous and BIPOC folks, like for their communities, because the systems and structures that were put in place were, like you were saying, like so rooted with structural racism, and we're not working and we're reproducing those experiences of harm.
Right.
So there was no other option other than creating these systems outside of the system. So it feels important to just like, especially because I'm sitting here as a white person, like saying like restorative justice is this thing, like it's coming from my mouth and like it's something that I've created or had some part in creating, which I really haven't. And
Right.
I think that anyone who is doing this work or wanting to get in touch with this work has to pay homage and understand that like this is coming from community work. It is coming from BIPOC folks, and it is coming from like indigenous practices that have been around for centuries, and decades and millennia, like, you know. But it's not something that's like, oh, all of a sudden, like restorative justice is like this thing that like we're now all gonna get on board with.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. That just feels important to say.
Totally.
Definitely. I feel like that's a big piece of restorative justice, is taking the responsibility, but also seeing where you can move forward with that. So it's our responsibility to honor where it comes from, but how can we embody it in our work, and how can we make sure that we're including everybody in this work while honoring the fact that just because a white woman or someone of the right skin color picked it up doesn't mean it's their practice. So honoring where it came from kind of honors the restorative justice practice, because it's honoring both people and that they are people.
Yeah.
I don't know if that made sense, but
absolutely. And I think too, like when I think about restorative justice or restorative practices, especially in the context of intimate violence, you know, I think about, I'll speak for myself and my own journey and not make assumptions. The fact of how I was socialized and brought up as an advocate was that you don't ever do RJ. There is never, right. You just don't do it. It's not even like, oh, maybe it's possible, or, you know, maybe in this particular, it's just no. It's like you can do it in any other situation except intimate violence.
Yeah.
And,
no, I agree with you. I felt the same way.
Yeah, I would agree with you too.
Yeah. And so I was like thinking that, okay, and I think that's where that distinction between like my training and understanding about how communities were doing it elsewhere and like then coming into this work professionally, that dichotomy kind of stayed firm. And then I get to Wesleyan. And
it was like
yeah, well, for many reasons, yes. And also survivors and people who had experienced harm would come to me and say, is there any way that I could just have an opportunity to talk to the person who's done harm to me, tell them what happened and how it impacted me, and like maybe figure out a way so that they just don't do it again? Like I really don't want to go through the whole Title IX process. I really don't want to do that. I also don't want to go to the police to report it in that way. I just want to talk to them. I just want to have a conversation. And that happened so consistently and so many times. And so many times I was like,
you're like, I don't know, can we do that? You're like, this goes against what I learned and was, right.
And I was like, well, you know, I can safety plan with you if like you're feeling compelled to like connect with this person, and like we can think about this on like a one-on-one kind of basis.
Yeah.
We don't really have a system like that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so finally I was like, okay, enough people are coming to me. And what they're also saying is, if restorative justice is kind of in this bucket over here, what I think about the opposite of that is cancel culture, right?
Yeah.
Which
Or like blacklisting, right? Was another thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So saying that once someone has done harm, there is no space for you in my world ever.
Right.
And you are not worthy of humanity. You are not worthy of any kind of engagement, connection, because there is no other way to hold you accountable that feels meaningful.
Yeah.
Right? Which is, it's not malicious for the sake of being malicious. It's, I don't have any other tools.
Right.
To find a meaningful way that feels healing. So this is my option. Right. And because cancel culture has really dug its claws in, I think, people who've experienced harm also would come to me and say, I'm scared to ask for help because I don't want this person to get blacklisted.
Yeah.
I don't want this person to be excluded or canceled from everything. I just want to figure out what my pathway towards healing looks like and not have it be something that's broadcasted, basically, like, to the whole campus.
Right. And then everyone gets involved or has a say when we're forgetting that it's about the person who the harm was done to and the person who did the harm. It becomes like a community response, which sometimes we've seen obviously the opposite, more likely to blame the victim, to be shaming the victim and silencing the victim. But because of cancel culture, there is that either, fully opposite, like spectrum of responses of, shunning that person and blacklisting them and, like even harassing that person who's done the harm. And I've heard that from clients too, where there's a client who's been wanting to report what happened to them, but their biggest reason for not is, in addition to kind of their own feelings and fears, is I don't want to ruin their life. That's literally the phrase, because they're, like you were saying, their only option to report it, other than Title IX, because they're not at the same university, was to go through the criminal justice system. And that just didn't feel right for that client. And so I've heard the same kind of sentiment from numerous clients over the years of saying, I just want them to know that what they did was wrong. I just want them to know that they hurt me and not do it again, like you were saying. But there's no how, like how do we get there? And that's, I feel like, what's so interesting to me about this restorative justice and practices is how can we as advocates give survivors what they're asking for? And not everyone, right? There are still plenty of survivors who want to and have every right to go through other reporting options if that feels right for them. But for the survivors who are, and sounds like a lot that you're working with, are asking for this, not even alternative, but just an option that doesn't exist for them. Like, how can we give it,
And I feel like the restorative practices also honor that intimate relationship that they had maybe before everything happened. Like maybe this person and them had a really good connection and there was a bad couple weeks. And obviously abuse is abuse. That's wrong. But how do we help that person that was once someone we cared about get back to that person that they once were or improve themselves? And I think that is so telling of the survivors, that they really see the true person, and then restorative justice is kind of their way of allowing the community to be like, yeah, they did wrong, but let's get them back to this kind person or a more informed person.
Right, because also engaging in restorative practices is also prevention.
Yeah,
exactly.
Like it's not primary prevention like the public health model that tells us of looking at risk factors and all of that kind of stuff. That was really intelligent. but it is prevention. It's prevention at a different part of the process. But if cancel culture is there's no space in my world, so you just can't come back, where do they go? They go somewhere else. They either get expelled or go to a different university or go to a different community to try and start fresh. And make new connections. And there still hasn't been an opportunity for understanding, okay, what really happened and why was what I did not okay? Because
and how do I not do it again?
Right,
Like, how
exactly.
do I not?
How do I
Even for
prevent
their
that
own-
harm from occurring again?
Right. Like even looking at it as not just, obviously we want people to be like, okay, I don't want to harm another person, but even for their own self of,
Yeah.
I don't want to get in trouble again. I don't want to have my education at, jeopardy again. I don't want to have my job at jeopardy again. So I don't want to, engage in this behavior again, in addition to causing the type of harm that, that they did to that person. So I feel like there's both ways that they can get support, right? In that education of like, what you did was wrong and here's why, and here's how it was harmful. Here's how it harmed that person, but here's also how it harmed you and your life, how can we prevent that?
And it's not to say that the harm wasn't the harm, like we've said before, and to like be apologetic to someone who's hurt someone else. It's to recognize the fact that we are all socialized into understanding these scripts of what it means to have sex, to be in relationships, and what those expectations look like. And a lot of that is, okay, here's a definition of consent. Now, when you're two people or more people naked in a bed, figure out how that definition works. And
go for it.
Right, and that's where it stops.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's, I'm an educator. I've dedicated my life to doing this prevention work, and I still see the holes that we're leaving people with of, okay, but what do I do with this stuff about my family and what they've told me about what sex is supposed to be like, and my religious upbringing and what they've told me about what sex is supposed to be like, and then my friends, and oh my gosh, and social media, like how do I pull
social media?
It's terrible.
Horrible.
And like pull all of that together into how am I going to negotiate how two or more bodies can be in connection intimately with each other. And I was just going to say, like, and when there's harm done, when that happens, that's real and that's true. Like, I work with survivors, right? Like I know, and I can't say that I know. I can deeply empathize with what that could feel like to have that violation and have that experience. And restorative practices do not make light of that.
Right.
Right? It's rather seeing, okay, because this was so hurtful and harmful, like how do you give someone the tools to ensure that they really don't do this again? Instead of banishing them or locking them up and throwing away the key, where also we have to also pay attention to the fact that sexual violence happens in prison. Right? Like people can be survivors of sexual violence in prison.
A lot.
Like so
way more than people realize. Yeah.
Right. So prisons are also systems that are re-perpetuating this type of violence.
Sure.
So I don't know. I feel like I was on my soapbox and I don't really know where I'm going. That's what I'm thinking.
But I think a big piece of what you were saying was the information that each person is given about what a relationship is and what it means to connect with another is so individualized, and it's based on where you grew up. It's based on the education you were allowed or given and the opportunities that you were given. And when you have two people coming from very different backgrounds or very different understandings of what a relationship is, and it might be their first relationship, they don't think to talk about it, and then that hurt happens and that harm happens, it doesn't automatically make everybody in that situation, one is amazing and one is a hurtful person. And I think what you were saying was so, I just lost my train of thought, but it was it was just very, it honors both experiences. it honors the victim and it empowers them to use their experience to talk to the abuser or the perpetrator and kind of be like, hey, what you did wasn't okay. And it still empowers the victim. It's not taking away that piece where the victim feels honored, but it also gives the victim the opportunity to be like, hey, you know what? Like, let's make sure this doesn't happen again. Let's make sure the next person that you're with doesn't experience this. And I think that's so beautiful.
And that's often, or not, I won't say often, for some survivors and victims, that is what they want. For a lot, it's, you know, they have every right to be like, I never want to speak to that person again. I don't want to ever have to interact. They have every right to do that. That person harmed them. They don't have to, you know, forgive them or listen to their apology, whatever. They can do whatever feels safest for them. So that is not to say, right, like, that they have to accept this person back into their life with welcome arms or nothing. No. You can absolutely say, no, this person hurt me. They traumatized me. They ruined my life, whatever that is, and 100% hold space for that. But the practices are to allow that the offender to still be seen as a human being, like you were saying way back in the beginning, that is capable of growth and change. And the ultimate goal of all of our work, prevention or counseling or otherwise, you know, we all want to see in a perfect world that there's no more of this violence, right? So if we can help people to not reoffend, however that looks like, whether through our prevention education programs, talking about consent, all of that. But I also think about, even in our programs, when we talk about like defining abuse, and I think about how we use the words power and control over and over again, all those things. But I think I have noticed how I have shifted the way I've taught it over the years. And like maybe 5-6 years ago, I was really coming from a place of like, almost not using this language, but almost like making the abuser seem like this monster, you know, like this horrible person who is choosing to hurt another person and they're just evil, you know, like almost like this extreme version, right? And I think, you know, I've noticed the way that I've shifted in being like, you know, yes, it's not okay. Yes, it's harmful. Yes, it is a choice, right? They are choosing, and it is sometimes calculated, and it is, you know, them behaving in a way to gain that power, to have that control over that person, and that's not okay. But there are people who have the capacity to unlearn those behaviors and, you know, and behave in a healthy way and in a future relationship or with another person or whatever. Or even maybe, you know, there's other agencies we work with at the Women's Center who do work with offenders and kind of reconciliation programs and things like family, you know, reunification programs. So yeah, there's so much, I think, to this conversation. And obviously we've barely kind of hit the tip of the iceberg.
Scratch the surface.
Scratch the surface. That's the one. But I do want to give kind of the floor for final thoughts as we kind of wrap up the conversation. I know there's so much more, obviously, that we could probably talk about, but as we kind of begin to wrap up.
So one quick thing. This has been so rich and lovely. I basically sleep with this book under my pillow. And I think that anyone who, like, you can see there's Post-it notes, like this is a well-loved book. It's called Beyond Survival: Strategies and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement.
Ooh.
And it's edited by Ajaris Dixon and Leah Lakshmi Pyapsna Samarasinha. And it's a collection of essays from transformative justice practitioners who are sharing their experiences, their resources, their wisdom of doing restorative and transformative justice work specifically around sexual violence.
Wow, cool.
And if this book, to say this book changed my life and my perspective is an understatement. I read this book last summer and it shifted the whole way I do my job. It shifted the whole way that I think about myself as a professional. And it gave me permission really, and the tools to say, RJ is possible. And not only is it possible, but it is the only equitable pathway forward to responding to intimate violence in a way that doesn't just continue to hurt people. And so I've just been like throwing this book everywhere that I can.
Like, everyone read this.
Like,
Just read
really,
it.
truly, like everywhere.
I'm gonna buy a copy. You've convinced me.
I know. I'm like, I'm gonna go buy a copy after this.
Honestly, buy it from the publisher, AK Press, because they're an amazing publisher that's local. And
Awesome.
also, like, I think they call themselves an anarchist publisher. It's rad. Lots of
Interesting.
We love it. We love it.
Yeah, so I just wanted to end with sharing that.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Holly, any last thoughts?
I just want to say thank you so much for coming on and like opening my eyes. I thought I knew what restorative justice was and I thought I understood it, but now I'm going to go buy that book and continue learning, obviously. I mean, you can never stop learning, but I think what you said in the beginning, that restorative practices are just a way to honor each other's humanity, is such an important thing in the world. I think people forget that people are people. We all have feelings, whether or not we're abusers or we're the victims or we're the survivors. Everybody has emotions, and I think honoring the humanity is such a great way to move forward and really honors everybody's experience, and it allows people to grow and it allows people to change. So thank you. I really appreciated it.
Yeah, that was so beautifully said. And I agree. I think that if we can quote, like pop that out as the quote, the main kind of message of our conversation today, because obviously, yeah, there's so much more to learn. I am like just beginning to kind of dive into this subject and kind of learn more about it. I'm way behind and need to catch up to what's been happening for centuries, as you were talking about. And so obviously privileged white person, you know, like white woman coming from that lens. So got to do some learning, you know, on what makes sense. And I love what you said, kind of combining what you said in the beginning about bringing, you know, honoring people's humanity. And then what you just said at the end of the most equitable way forward for all, right? Like that this is what we're really trying to accomplish in the work that we all do for survivors at the center of it. And I think just reiterating what we were saying before, that, you know, I'm sure I would love for anyone who's watching to give us feedback, questions, thoughts on this conversation, on this episode. We're all still very much learning. Obviously, Holly and I are, you know, really curious to learn even more. And that's why we were so excited to have Johanna with us tonight. And I think, you know, let us know how you see it. Let us know how you could see it happening at WCSU, what that would look like or could look like for survivors. And of course, remembering like nothing we said tonight negates a survivor's experience. Nothing that we said tonight requires survivors to, you know, move a certain way through the world or decide to report in a certain way, or should, you know, sway anyone to respond to their own experience in any way, right? Your feelings are valid, your experience is valid. But it is, I totally agree with you, Holly, that this conversation really opened my eyes. So I echo and second that thank you to you, Johanna, for joining us and making the time with us to talk about this really interesting and important subject. And I know you do, you know, trainings and things, right, on restorative justice in your work, maybe as a side project or as not supposed to say that.
No. I do trainings like on the side of like I'm trying to start my own consultancy business, low key, to just be able to like, yeah, hey, all right. But I am not qualified to be an RJ trainer whatsoever. That's why I was like,
like so I'm still going somewhat more the subject around these issues, but not necessarily through the expert lens of restorative justice.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes sense. But you're obviously a huge resource for your students, and a resource to us, obviously learning about these issues. So yeah, but I think that about wraps up our conversation. So Again, for anyone who's watching, please provide feedback, thoughts, questions, suggestions. We'd love to hear from you. And please share with your friends and tune in next week for our next episode. So thanks for listening. Bye.
Bye.